What a pleasure to be joined for the first time on Bad Faith podcast by Dr. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Those of you who tune into Rising regularly know that he is a regular guest to talk about foreign policy, one of my favorites to have on Rising, and it is a real joy to be able to talk to him in a longer format here on Bad Faith today. Welcome, Dr. Parsi.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
The pleasure is all mine, like I said. So part of why I wanted to have you on is because the last time we spoke on Rising, we were talking about an article that you had recently written in the New York Times called "The U.S. is not an indispensable peacemaker." And it was written around the meeting between President Xi and Putin around negotiations for peace in Ukraine, negotiations that U.S. officials cast a pretty skeptical eye upon. And I wondered, now that that is in the rearview mirror, what you make of two things. One, the U.S. response to an effort at peace negotiated by someone other than the United States. And two, what actually came out of that meeting.
Yeah, so what I write about in the New York Times piece is that, there was a moment, there was a time, an era in which almost all major peace efforts had to go through Washington one way or another. And that, the United States and Washington, D.C. was the central address for a lot of peace efforts. That is no longer the case, clearly. And I think it has many different reasons. One is that our foreign policy has just gotten more and more militarized. And as a result, we have kind of played out our ability to be able to be a peacemaker because we're a co-belligerent in so many different conflicts. But also it's because it's a choice we've made. We've just gone in this direction in which we want to take sides. We abhor neutrality, and we believe that all of these different things are a struggle in which history is going to be on the right side, and we want to make sure that we pick that right side, rather than recognizing that moralizing these issues beyond what is reasonable only make it more difficult to get them resolved. And if we're going for total victory, which seems to be the case almost all the time, then resolutions will not come about. And this is now very much playing itself out in the way that Xi visited Moscow and the success that the Chinese had in negotiating or mediating a normalization between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I think to a certain extent, the United States has been taken by surprise because up until recently, the Chinese showed no interest, ambition, or capacity to be able to do these things. But now when they are, it is going to be problematic if you have countries in the global south, such as Brazil, pushing for a peace agreement. You got the Chinese pushing for a peace agreement. And the United States is firm in saying no to all of those different efforts. And then kind of hiding behind, well, the Ukrainians should decide. Ukrainian agency should be at the center. Well, reality is that when the Chinese first put forward their proposal, the 12-point plan, the Ukrainians gave it a careful, showed some careful interest in it, which makes a lot of sense. If you're Ukraine, the last thing you want to do is to dismiss the Chinese and then push them deeper into the corner of Russia. But that goes for the United States as well. If the U.S. is dismissing any effort by the Chinese to mediate or negotiate almost out of hand, well, then that can also push the Chinese deeper into closer to Russia. And that's not good for Ukraine. So I don't really quite understand why Ukrainian agency matters when we're pushing for war. But if the Ukrainians start to show some openness towards diplomacy, then we dismiss it without even thinking about it.
So help me understand what is in the 12-point plan. What is China proposing with respect to these negotiations here? Because I do think that there is a presumption from some sectors of the U.S. media, foreign policy apparatus, that whatever China would be proposing is in fact in bad faith. There is a skepticism that hangs over any actions by various nations that we have kind of characterized as bad faith, authoritarian, these kinds of things. So what is actually being proposed? And are there kind of substantive pushbacks being offered from the West, or are they kind of relying on the idea that whatever China might bring to the equation is in fact in bad faith?
Look, so there's quite a lot that goes into the US's position and reaction to what the Chinese are doing. And much of it may have nothing to do with what's in those 12 points. And admittedly, there wasn't anything particularly substantive there. I think a part of the background that one has to recognize here is that there is a suspicion on the American side, which may not be entirely misplaced, that the Chinese effort here is an effort to show itself as a constructive player, as a peacemaker, as a stabilizer, at a moment when the United States is portraying China as a threat to the global order, as China's rise is a problem for world stability. And this is a way for the Chinese to counter that. The suspicion is on the American side. And it doesn't matter if they're successful or not. It matters if they just try and portray themselves as trying, and as a result, still get that gain. Having said that, I think it's nothing wrong with being skeptical at times. Countries have various interests, and oftentimes they have interests that they're not perhaps necessarily very open about. But when you get paralyzed by your own skepticism, that you cannot see any potential openings because you're just so cynical about what others would be doing, and you would always choose the worst possible interpretation of why they're doing something rather than entertain that there may be other possibilities for their conduct as well. That's where I think we get into a really tricky situation that is really harming ourselves because we miss opportunities. In the case here, I do think that the Chinese are doing this to a certain extent in order to brand themselves internationally as a stabilizer, that the global system will benefit from China's rise, in contrary to the way the United States has sought to portray China. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a genuine interest in stability, or that there isn't a genuine desire to resolve issues. And we saw that very clearly in the Saudi-Iranian case. That actually is benefiting the region. It is stabilizing it, and that's good. Now, if the Chinese get benefit from it, then we should ask ourselves, well, why can't we be more in that business and draw such benefits by doing that type of a stabilization?
I mean, that's what's so interesting about it, is that in the context of what we were discussing last week with talks of ceasefire and the like, the U.S. position seemed to be absolutely no. There's no upside to a ceasefire. For there to be a ceasefire would be to entrench the Russian position, to basically commit to conceding chunks of land that were grabbed in an illegal invasion. And as a consequence, it was a very kind of black or white framing that was coming from the West. And it strikes me as interesting because in the face of China's efforts to negotiate, it didn't feel as though we were hearing an alternative plan. It was more of a shouting it down, voting down, as opposed to a yes and, to use a kind of a improv speak here. So I wonder, is that view of the thing that I have accurate in your assessment? And if not, what short of returning to kind of a pre-2014 territorial arrangement do you think the West would agree to? And is it really the case that anything short of that they're basically saying is bending the knee to Putin in a way that is considered to be unacceptable?
I think it's a great question. And it's something that I have wrestled with, and I've had plenty of conversations, folks, with both on the European side and the American side. And I think there's a couple of misconceptions that first need to be untangled here. There seems to be an assumption in their arguments that the beginning of diplomacy is the automatic end of fighting and an automatic beginning of a ceasefire. I don't see many historical precedents for that assumption. There's plenty of cases, in fact, most cases, in which the parties talk and continue to fight at the same time. So I don't think we should confuse the beginning of diplomacy with a ceasefire. It could lead to a ceasefire. It could also not lead to a ceasefire. It could just be that the two sides need to talk to each other in order to make sure that they collect intelligence, in order to make sure that they don't miss an opportunity for real diplomacy and advancement towards some sort of a ceasefire or other arrangement if it shows up, in which you cannot afford to start diplomacy at that point. You already need to have talks ongoing in order to be able to seize it. But the fact that they're pushing this line that, a ceasefire is so bad, makes me a little bit uncomfortable because it makes me think, well, hold on, you know very well that diplomacy is not automatically a ceasefire. So why this really rigid opposition to diplomacy, hiding behind the argument that a ceasefire would be bad for the Ukrainians right now because it would consolidate the Russians controlling 17 or so percent of Ukrainian territory? It's presented very black and white, and I don't think it is. Even if a ceasefire were to go forward, um, that is neither an automatic guarantee that Ukrainian territory would not be able to be regained. And I fully understand the perspective that there's no desire for a ceasefire until the Ukrainians feel that they're in a better position for such a ceasefire. I understand that. I don't understand how that necessarily means that talks cannot begin. Why there's such a fear of beginning those talks. And it raises the suspicion. And in some conversations I had with the Europeans, in which they essentially say that the ceasefire would be bad right now because even though Russia is not winning, it has not suffered enough, it's not lost enough in order for there to be a ceasefire, which then leaves the impression that the objective here, frankly, isn't necessarily helping the Ukrainians as much as it is a desire from the Western and particularly in Europe to weaken Russia so much so that the Europeans feel that it cannot constitute a threat for another decade or two. And if that is the case, and again, I'm not saying it is, but one is left with that impression at times in these discussions. If that is the case, then I think we have to then be honest that this is not about helping the Ukrainians as much as it is about helping Europe helping itself. And as one European official at one point told me that, in a certain extent, Europe may be using the Ukrainians as cannon fodder in a war that they'd rather have the Ukrainians fight with Russia than Europe fighting itself. Again, I want to emphasize, it's not, I'm not saying that is the case. I'm just saying that it's odd to me that there is such a strong hesitation and resistance to beginning diplomacy and then confusing that with a ceasefire, because those two things are not necessarily the same thing.
And in fact, I mean, many on the left have picked up on the language that has been used by U.S. officials, language about fighting to the last Ukrainian, language about wanting to weaken Putin, weaken Russia. And it's curious to me, not just for the reasons that you just articulated, that is obviously not in the interest necessarily of Ukrainians who are being used as cannon fodder here, but what does that even look like? Do you have a sense of when people say things like that, what level of diminishment that they're conceptualizing Russia will actually incur? Because that has some pretty significant implications for what Western involvement, U.S. involvement will actually look like. I think there is a broad acknowledgement that Ukraine on its own doesn't have the capacity to defeat and push out Russia, and certainly not the capacity on its own to diminish Russia as a superpower in a meaningful way. And so what we're really saying is, through this proxy war, how much of a bite out of Russia's power, influence, financial stability, et cetera, is America looking for here? Because the fear is that it's something approximating kind of a total diminishment, which basically is an admission that we're heading toward World War III. Anything short of that, it becomes a question of, well, how do you even assess when Russia has been weakened enough to want to withdraw, or to want to withdraw aid, or to want to actually start to engage meaningfully in peace discussions?
I don't think there's any clear answers to that, because when asked, okay, so what are we talking about? Are we talking about a complete regaining of the Donbass? Are we talking about a complete regaining of Crimea? You get different answers, and certain elements in the West, certainly the U.S. intelligence, believes that the Ukrainians cannot take back Crimea, even with the significant support that they are receiving. And if there's one point that seems to be not consensus, but I would see a lot of convergence around, is that if there is a serious effort to take Crimea, that's when the risk of the Russians using nuclear weapons tend to increase significantly. So exactly where is enough doesn't seem to have been answered. And it raises the question mark, okay, let's say that there is a spring offensive. according to what the White House is saying, at least privately, uh, there's not a strong belief that it will dramatically change where the battle lines are. I mean, it's increasingly looking like World War One, in which fighting goes on, and the battle line moves a couple of inches this way and that way, but ultimately, all it does is just leaves a lot of people killed. What happens after that? And if it is successful, are we going to be in the same situation as we were in perhaps last summer, in which when the Ukrainians were doing really well, there was also a very strong resistance to diplomacy, because that would then, once the Ukrainians have momentum, why would you want to stop? So this is a very typical dilemma that exists in these type of situations. You don't want to negotiate when you're weak because you're weak, and you don't want to negotiate when you're strong because you're strong. So when do you negotiate? And that is not necessarily a deliberate dilemma. I mean, this is actually a genuine dilemma in which the countries themselves find themselves in which it's really difficult to find the moment and the political will to move towards an exit. And that's part of the reason why it's actually important to have ongoing negotiations, because if you make that decision, you want to be able to actually utilize existing diplomacy to move in that direction rather than to start from scratch. Because in the beginning, diplomacy is going to be very slow. It's going to be very tricky. There's going to be a lot of challenges in the mechanics and the logistics of diplomacy. It's going to take time, and you may actually lose the window that you have, because these windows may not be very long at all.
Do we have any greater sense than we did last year about what the attitudes are like, not just in Ukraine, but in Eastern Ukraine in particular? A lot of, I think, some of the chronology that separates how the left is coming to this than as opposed to the mainstream has to do with the left's perception of the events that led up to the conflict, the failure of the Minsk agreement, the idea that at some point on the table was the idea of some degree of democracy, self-determination in the disputed territory, to resolve the ongoing internal conflict that had been happening for years, and the kind of betrayal of that possibility, the undermining of that possibility, the lack of follow through on there being a kind of a democratic resolution to the political differences in the more Russian sympathetic eastern part of the country. Do we have any sense of where things stand now with Ukrainians, especially now that there have been these moves to, for example, make Russian illegal, and kind of these kind of political moves that further marginalize people in Ukraine, Ukrainians who were kind of the subject of the internal conflict to begin with?
So I know there's other scholars who've done a tremendous amount of work on that, including during this period of war. And I'm not knowledgeable enough to be able to do justice to your question there, but I do think it is important to point out that in these war situations, it is really, really difficult to expect that there will be the sense of, the flourishing of democracy in which people can easily express their views. I mean, it's not surprising to me to hear from journalists that have come back from Ukraine that at least in eastern Ukraine, where they're seeing the war, where they're being killed, there is a greater degree of openness towards negotiations, potentially ceasefire, than you have elsewhere in Ukraine. And again, what we're hearing or what the Ukrainians want is primarily coming, I think, from the official channels. And that's their job. That's what they have to do. They have to put forward a very united, they have to present themselves in a very united way. That's totally understandable. This is a country that's been invaded. It's a country that has suffered tremendously from this invasion. But I think if you actually want to get to a solution, we have to be able to distance ourselves a little bit from this. Unless, of course, our solution is what I wrote about in the New York Times op-ed, that we come in, we take sides, and we're going for total victory. Well, so let me give you an example from Europe. There's some European countries that have played significant roles negotiating wars and mediating peace elsewhere in the world when the conflict is far away from them. All of the different principles that they're following in order to do that, they have completely thrown out of the window on this conflict because it's close to them. And it really raises the questions. Okay, so peacemaking is only something you do far, far away. Those principles holds over there, but not when it involves yourself or your own security. It really has shook me, having grown up in Europe and seeing how, in many cases, Europe has played a very constructive role as of late in various conflicts, but is completely unwilling to use those same principles, employ those same principles in the case of Ukraine. And that is not to say that it's wrong of them to think that Ukraine is right in this conflict and that Russia is wrong. Russia did invade that country illegally. But you can make that argument in so many other cases. I mean, I'm sure if you're sitting in Yemen right now, you have a very strong sense that you are on the right vis-a-vis the Saudis, or vice versa, if you're on the Saudi-supported side of Yemen. That doesn't necessarily mean that those principles that have been developed over the course of history on how to be able to find constructive solutions to these horrible, horrible problems suddenly have to be out of the window just because it's happening to you, just because it's happening in a country near you.
So why do you think that is, that those principles have been thrown out the window? And I mean, can you help give us a clearer picture of what those principles are and how you'd like to see them being applied in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, in almost all of other conflicts, immediately there is an effort for there to be mediation and ongoing diplomacy. And it's even short of talking about ceasefire. But once diplomacy is going, ceasefires tend to be something that is tested. Truces are tested. I mean, we all praise the fact that there was a truce in Yemen, and we're very happy to see that that truce has held, even though it has expired. One could make similar arguments that this is consolidating the Houthis' gains, or this is consolidating the Saudi gain in this, and there's a wrong and a right in this side. Well, I'm sure there is. But at the end of the day, coming from the outside, one of the things we can do is to bring this to an end, in which, as I write in the New York Times op-ed, that type of a pragmatic approach, if statecraft is the pragmatic management of conflict, then we have to recognize that peace almost always comes at the expense of at least some justice. But if we're going at it from this very moralistic view that it has to be complete justice, rest assured conflict will then endure as well.
Do you have any theories about why it might be that these principles that make so much sense and that European peace brokers tend to apply in other parts of the world aren't being brought to bear at home? Do you think it's just about the sense of proximity and the threat of Putin, or the kind of political interest in maintaining U.S. hegemony, or these things? Do you think it has to do with, I mean, other kinds of perhaps historical, dare I even say, kind of colonial impulses, where Europe has exported all kinds of policing mechanisms to other parts of the world that it declined to apply to itself, at least for some time? I'm thinking of things like fingerprinting technology that was used in India because of a belief that Indians were particularly criminal and difficult to tell apart. But there was a real reluctance to bringing that technology back home at first, and was only applied, I think, first to the Irish before it spread more broadly. I mean, do you think I'm going too far here? Because it does sometimes feel to me that the rules that are applied for the rest of the world are contingent on some kind of belief in the West's kind of moral superiority or clarity of thinking and ability to resolve their own problems without the need for some kind of outside guidance and administration. And in fact, some of the way that people have balked against the idea of China getting involved in the first place does strike me as sort of, I don't know, a continuation of a generalized opposition to outsiders, shall we say, dabbling in Europe's affairs and the West's affairs?
I mean, those are excellent questions. And I would be wrong if I were to say that I think I have a clear answer to that. I would perhaps say that perhaps you are assuming way more thinking than actually has taken place. Because at least in some of the cases that I saw in Europe when all of this happened, I would describe it as panic more than calculations. Now, that doesn't mean that there were no calculations. And if I were to speculate, I would perhaps say that, this invasion really made the Europeans realize how dependent they are on the United States. And made them also perhaps a little bit more sensitive to the idea that they really do want to have a continuation of unipolarity. They really want to have the United States continue to be the global dominant power. Europe is one of the few areas in the world that truly has benefited from American hegemony. And it has benefited, there's no doubt about it. If you ask about the Middle East, the answer would be very different. If you were to ask about Africa or South America, it would also be different. If you ask about Asia, it would probably be more towards at least a significant portion of the population. They're thinking that it has been a stabilizing factor, the military presence that the United States has had. But seeing what the Russians did perhaps gave them a bit of a recognition that we're really moving towards a multipolar world in which some of the restraints that have existed in other countries may now be gone. And they don't like to see that. And understandably so. If you're sitting in their shoes, that might be exactly how you would be thinking. Again, I want to say that I'm speculating here because most of what I saw when this all happened was panic and a lot of rash decision. I'm not saying that it wasn't right to make some of those decisions, but in the case of Sweden's application to NATO, for instance, I think that was a completely panic-ridden decision. The Russians were in no place to be able to invade Sweden. Sweden had faced far worse security environment during the Cold War, and it kept its neutrality. And Sweden rushed this through with almost no proper debate, and it's now backfiring big time because they have to change their constitution and many other things to appease Erdogan in Turkey, and they may still not be able to get into NATO.
I mean, speaking of this question of a move to multipolarity, I mean, you've spoken on Rising and elsewhere about the frank kind of lack of consensus there is in the global South about this kind of endless, unbound support for funding the war in Ukraine and some frustrations that have emerged from the global South about how this war is impacting them. At what point do you think, if at all, that will matter in a way that impacts the West's behavior here? I mean, I've seen stories. I think I just saw that Kenya is moving to buying oil in shillings as opposed to the US dollar. There are these kind of moves that are happening. But when does it shift from being a kind of symbolic change to being really reflective of balance, a shift in the balance of power that might start to cause Western actors to behave differently?
Well, the first part has already happened because the global South is going in an independent route. By and large, does not mean that they support the Russians. They voted against Russia at the UN. They voted that this was an illegal annexation. They did not recognize the annexation of the Donbass and the other districts, regions in Ukraine. But they're also not jumping on board with the sanctions or the approach in which we are very, very skeptical, if not outright opposed to diplomacy. So that has already happened. And it was very clear that while the United States was very effective in doing coalition management, alliance management with other Western powers, it had really no resonance whatsoever outside of the West and a few Asian countries in Africa, Latin America, etc. It has not resonated at all. Whether that will then come and impact the thinking in Washington, I have to say, I'm surprised that a year into it, we're still not seeing it. We're still not seeing any understanding of what this is costing the US and the West as a whole by being so tone deaf to the concerns and the demands and the perspectives of the global South, which constitutes roughly 40 to 50% of the world's population. Will it change? Oftentimes, these things don't change until they have to change. At this point, there still seems to be a belief that we can continue going at this the way we are. We still talk about this conflict as if it's about the rules-based order, not recognizing that that is exactly the framing that will not resonate with large parts of the global South. And it remains unclear when it will shift. But when it shifts, it will likely shift because we had to, and we already ran our course. We're not so good at changing and adjusting in the middle of this in a proactive way, I fear. But I think it's really going to be to the expense of the U.S. And let me just say one other thing.
Please.
In Washington, oftentimes, there is this talking point, and it's not entirely false. On the contrary, it's quite true, that one of the attractive angles of China and Africa and the Middle East is that the Chinese are not getting involved in the internal affairs of those countries. They're not pushing for human rights. They're not criticizing those different things. And they're pursuing an approach in which they respect the sovereignty of each state. This is how they frame it. And as a result, they expect not to be criticized for their internal handling of issues, nor will they criticize those other states. I think there's definitely truth to that. But there's two problems. First of all, it's not as if we are pushing for human rights. And if we are, we're not particularly effective at it. We're pushing it at the countries we don't like. We're not pushing human rights in the countries that we actually are allied with. So they tend to get a pass, or just some irrelevant statements of criticism, but nothing that actually affects the substance of the relationship. But I think there's another matter here that is more important than this. And that is the fact that countries react to what they perceive as threats and potential threats. And in the case of the United States, a lot of countries that are actually very good friends with the United States want to remain friends with the United States. We're absolutely terrified to see how quickly the United States could turn Russia completely off of the international financial system. That is a threat, because at the end of the day, the United States has had a tendency for the last 2 decades of electing rather rash and less than balanced leaders who have pursued policies that have been somewhat reckless. If you have the combination of reckless leadership with immensely powerful tools, the natural instinct of these countries, even those who are friends of the United States, is to see, are there other powers in this globe that I can use to balance the way the United States could do damage to me? And this is part of the reason why a lot of these states that are absolutely great friends of the United States nevertheless strongly welcome multipolarity, because it's an insurance policy that in case the United States turns against them and chooses to use some of these tools against them, they have something to shield themselves with. So will there be a migration towards a greater use of other currencies than the dollar? I suspect yes, because if the United States can turn you off of all trade, if all of your trade is in dollar, then it's a rational thing for you to make sure that you have a plan B.
I mean, to that end, folks have made a lot of this statement that Ron DeSantis gave to Tucker Carlson, expressing a much more moderate position toward Ukraine, shall we say, than the bipartisan blob tends to have taken, saying that he doesn't referring to it, I think he characterized it as a territorial dispute. And later he kind of walked that back a little bit, has been accused of flip-flopping. But it's perceived to be the case that offering a more, shall we say, isolationist approach to this conflict is a really fruitful lane for folks participating in the 2024 election, potentially on the left, although there doesn't seem to be much in the way of left challengers who would offer some counter approach to what Biden is offering. But it's most certainly on the right, where there seems to be a little bit of an arms race for who can occupy the no more military spending kind of lane, more isolationist lane of the Republican Party. I know the word isolationist is charged, and I prefer not to be using it, but I don't know what other word to use. And I wonder what you make of that. In the United States, just, I hear what you're saying about the concern that given our more radical, shall we say, authoritarian electoral choices of late, that people want multipolarity. Non-Americans want multipolarity. At the same time, ironically, it is that more, right-wing authoritarian part of our politics that at least is claiming to want to be less interventionist than the more so-called moderate Biden Democrats. So, what do you make of that? And do you think that the things that DeSantis is saying right now are sincere, or that he's just kind of playing this game because he understands the political benefit?
So if I could say one thing about isolationism first, even though I agree with you, it's not the term to be used here, but it is an accusation that is made by those who prefer the traditional, or at least the policies of the last 2-3 decades, to accuse voices that are skeptical of these wars, etc., being isolationist. And it's a completely false accusation, because at least when it comes to the restraint movement, which Quincy is a part of. We completely reject that because we're actually in favor of far more engagement with the rest of the world. We just don't think that bombing other countries qualifies as engagement. That's not engagement. We want to trade, we want to have diplomatic relations. We'd like to see the US play a much bigger diplomatic role. To call that isolationism, that some of these folks from the blob do, essentially is an admission that if you're not out there bombing countries, then you're not engaging them. And that's an understanding of engagement that we completely reject. And I think it's important to point out that, because there are those who perhaps want to just completely withdraw altogether from, I don't know who those are, I haven't heard anyone say that. But to want to have a different approach to the rest of the world that is more peaceful, that is more centered on diplomacy, far more military restraint, for that to be accused of isolationism tells you how bizarre the conversation has gotten in Washington. And it's in Washington. It's not in the rest of the country. In the rest of the country, poll after poll after poll show that this more restrained foreign policy is exactly what jives with the very instincts of the majority of Americans. And these are Americans that may never ever heard of restraint or are not following foreign policy, but it's jiving with their instincts. And then as to your question, this is precisely why I think it will be quite a challenge for the administration in 2024. Because if the war by then has not brought to some form of a conclusion, if there is continued very significant support without anything in particular to show for, in the sense that there truly is a stalemate on the ground in Ukraine, then I suspect that whoever is on the right, likely, certainly if it's someone like Trump, will really make that a key element of the campaign. Usually foreign policy does not end up being that. But in a case where we have paid so much money for that war that has not brought anything, has not been able to bring it to a positive conclusion, then I think they will see a significant opening, particularly mindful of the fact of how opinion in the United States has shifted when it comes to this issue. I think most people are still very supportive of the idea that Ukraine is right in this conflict, that Russia was wrong in invading it. But when it comes to what to do about it, what should and should not be done, we're seeing significant changes there, in which the question mark of why more diplomacy is not taking place is increasingly being raised. And I have to say, if that becomes a major element of the elections, I do not think it will play particularly favorable to the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, what do you make of this idea? I mean, this is something that is really rankling the left, and at least very online politics right now. There are those on the left who have been pointing out that if you want a more less militarized interventionist approach to foreign policy, shall we say, as opposed to isolationist, that the primary sources, at least in terms of elected officials, where you can find that approach at the moment is among more conservative leading people. That's not to say that most conservatives take that approach, or that most conservatives are opposing record military funding or anything like that. But to the extent that you're looking for elected officials who are willing to be at all reserved, measured, skeptical, demonstrate restraint about Ukraine war funding, or to want to push for a negotiation and things like that, they tend to be on the right. And you saw the whole fracas that happened over the Progressive Caucus letter last summer, or even what I perceive to be a fairly mild letter saying, hey, negotiation, that would be a good thing, right? At some point, maybe, please, sir, may have some more, was, criticized by most members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. I think Ro Khanna was one of the few to offer any defense of it. And that was dividing, that was a source of division on the left. Others hear leftists say things like that, like the most anti-war voices on the right. And they say, well, that's nothing more than a sop to conservative viewers, that you're trying to get conservatives to come over to your content, that you're plotting a move to the right, that it's not worth making that observation because so many of those conservative figures are acting in bad faith, or perhaps there are people like Ron DeSantis who are just trying to capitalize on discontent in the moment. And that you shouldn't even acknowledge that because it's bad faith. It's in bad faith. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that back and forth, given that you are someone who is more left oriented, who is vocally advocating for a more restrained, less militaristic, less interventionist approach to these kind of issues? And do you have any like frustration about the way that the kind of anti-war voices are being characterized as predominantly kind of right-leaning?
So again, a great question. I would start off by saying we should not forget that we are in a tremendously politicized moment in this country's history. And it is much easier for folks on the right to oppose this because it coincides with their political instinct of opposing whatever the current Democratic president does. And it's much harder for folks on the left to do something that can be perceived as countering the current Democratic president. Just 10, 15, 20 years ago, you would have seen a far greater diversity of views on this matter. I mean, obviously, during the Iraq War, we were also in a very, very strong groupthink position in which it took like 2-3 years before any Republican dared to come out and criticize the Iraq War. And I think what we can say at least is that these moments always end up creating more problems than good. Because when you don't have those diversity of views, when you do not allow the debate to be wide rather than this narrow, then ultimately it's negatively going to affect the decisions we make. Is there frustration? I would say, of course, there is frustration. There's frustration because at the end of the day, there's some on the right that perhaps are trying to use this more for political gain. There's folks on the left that I think probably are not entirely comfortable with not going out there talking about diplomacy and feel that that might be a bit of a contradiction to the positions that they usually take. I understand the argument that this is different from the previous wars because the previous wars were wars in which the United States either initiated them or took action without congressional authority. There were no clear plans, et cetera, et cetera. And here's a war that was initiated by Russia. I understand that. But that, to me, does not change, again, going back to the principles we talked about earlier on, as to why we suddenly should be against diplomacy. Even if the other side is the one that is initiating the war, even if they are wrong, doesn't necessarily mean that diplomacy as a result no longer should be used, because otherwise, essentially, diplomacy is only to be used when we have done something wrong. And that's certainly not a particularly principled position for anyone to take. So I do fear that the politicization has created a situation in which the debate on this issue has essentially taken second seat to the positions people want to take based on which party they belong to, et cetera. The American people are going to suffer from this. And I think, again, what this does, when you don't allow these voices to be part of this debate, those voices don't go away. They just find anti-establishment candidates to channel them. And that's what I think we saw to a large extent with Trump in 2016. So from my perspective, I think it would be tremendously problematic for elements on the left not to allow some of these voices, some of these arguments to be aired, to have candidates that are taking this side, to have actually a very good conversation and debate about this even within the left or within the Democratic Party, because otherwise you may be left with this perception that the only anti-war voices, the only anti-democracy or diplomacy voices, however self-interested or non-genuine as they may be, nevertheless are on the right. And to think that that is a good electoral strategy, well, I would be very skeptical about that.
Yeah, I mean, you characterize it as like the perception, but it's difficult for me, as frustrating as that reality is. It strikes me as a reality at this point. You know, I gave Ro Khanna some credit a moment ago for offering some defense of the CPC letter. At the same time, you know, I asked him recently on this show whether he felt there needed to be, or whether he would support some congressional investigation into the perpetrators of the Nord Stream sabotage, whether or not he supported an independent UN inquiry into what happened, you know, and he was somewhat dismissive of that. He's feeling like it wasn't necessary, feeling like it wasn't appropriate for an international body to be inquiring into the behavior of the U.S. intelligence agency and whether or not they were involved. And I don't know what to do with that. If he in some ways, and I think it's true, is the best that the left has to offer in terms of elected officials on these kinds of issues, and expresses that kind of a view that we're going to accept the security state's statements, kind of conclusory disavowals of having any involvement in Nord Stream, that he would kind of engage in some of the characterization of left journalists like Max Blumenthal that he has done in the past as Putin puppets for asking questions about America's role in the events that precipitated the conflict, even though there's an obvious acknowledgement that Russia is responsible for invading Ukraine point blank period. How is it not simply true that on paper, just like very much literally, that there are basically no anti-war voices on the left? And I wonder what you do with that, and what your organization does with that, and if there's any conversations that are had, and what you perceive to be the cause behind that. Even our DSA elected socialist leaning squad members don't seem to have been wanting to stick their heads out on this one.
Well, on the CPC letter, I think we do have to give Roe, as you did, credit, because he came out immediately and he defended the letter. He said he would not withdraw the letter, that he stood by the letter. And I think there were others who felt the same way, that perhaps didn't come out and say it because of the pressure that existed on them at the time.
From who?
I do think, well, I'm not going to name them now, but the bottom line is he showed that courage, and I think that's very important. I do think this is going to have to change because, we talked about it on Rising last time I was on, there's going to be a moment in which the White House will choose to shift towards diplomacy. And unless there are members of Congress right now that are willing to help create the political space for that shift, then that shift is going to become far more difficult, to the extent that the White House may yet again choose not to shift when an opportunity arises. And perhaps some in the White House even wanted to shift. There needs to be that political space. That political space needs to be created at least partly by a member of Congress. And it is not an anti-Biden position to do so. It is actually to help the administration have maximum maneuverability to be able to move in the direction of diplomacy when they decided that is what they want to do. If they themselves were taken aback by the very, very harsh reaction to that letter. And as you said, it was a very benign letter. It expressed significant support for the administration's policy, but it said it would be important to also add diplomacy to the mix. And those who clamped down on that letter clearly didn't know that the White House was already involved in some direct diplomacy with Russia, which was revealed just days later. I suspect partly because of the letter by Jake Sullivan and the Wall Street Journal. So they were acting, appears to me, in support of what they thought the White House wanted, but they had no clue what the White House wanted because the White House were already engaged in some degree of diplomacy. Not the extent to which I would like to see. I would like to see much more of it. But I think the White House itself saw that the very anti-diplomacy atmosphere is way more than they thought. And it's going to be a problem for them when the moment comes to actually shift to diplomacy.
I mean, we've been using that word diplomacy a lot. And before we go, I just want to make sure that we really are clear about what is meant. When you say you would like, the Biden administration is already engaging in some diplomacy, but not as much as you would have liked to have seen, what specifically is it that you would like to see more of? And are we talking about, what's actually on the table in terms of negotiations, the way that I've heard people say, Ukraine shouldn't settle to give up 1 inch of territory. Ukraine shouldn't stop fighting until Crimea is returned. Are we talking about making sure that options other than kind of like this absolutist Russia has to go completely back to pre-2014 are on the table? Are we talking about things that are short of that, like just having open channels, having more face-to-face meetings? I mean, what do we mean by diplomacy here?
Well, first of all, the United States and Russia needs to talk to each other because they're two countries with nuclear weapons, and there is a significant risk for the use of nuclear weapons if this conflict gets out of control. I mean, the Biden administration has tried, and I would say so far successfully, making sure that the conflict is managed so that it doesn't escalate to that point. But part of that management is to make sure that there is direct Russia American diplomacy. So the argument that nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine, yeah, but the United States also has its own relations with Russia. It has its rights to be able to engage directly in diplomacy with another major power that has 6,000 or so nuclear weapons. That needs to take place far more than what we've seen. I would commend the administration for at least having done some of that, but I don't see the value of not doing more of it. If we have done it, then it means it's already open. The door is open for it. So let's do more of it. Then when it comes to the diplomacy between the Ukrainians and Russians, let's remember up until April of last year, while the fighting was going on, they were in talks. And they were also in talks later on when the Turks negotiated, mediated, and made sure that there was a deal in regards to grain and food stuff that was being exported out of Ukraine. So why can we not do more to get those talks going? Things can surprise us. Openings may emerge that we could not have anticipated. And as a result, we might be able to find an exit out of this horrible war much sooner than otherwise. All of the parameters of the debate, of the outcome, cannot be decided before the negotiations. The parties can have their own positions, of course. But to come out and say, well, this is a negotiation to achieve exactly this, well, then what's the point of the negotiations? So I think there's some folks that are trying to, before negotiations take place, find out exactly what it would lead to. Mm-hmm. And we don't have that luxury because part of the negotiations is to find out what can be achieved. And if something is achieved that is not acceptable, well, then the party can walk back from it, of course, as well, as happened in April of last year when there were negotiations and apparently they didn't come to an agreement or there's some controversy on exactly what happened there.
I mean, I guess
not pursuing this and all of this is, and if I could just one last point.
Please.
Talking to some South Africans who made a very interesting point. South Africa negotiated its way out of apartheid with a government that at the beginning didn't even recognize the rights of Black South Africans to be counted as humans. And they still negotiated in order to be able to end apartheid. So given that, and there's so many other examples, this almost allergic reaction to diplomacy and engagement while fighting still goes on, to me is very, very difficult to understand.
I guess what I'm getting at is to try to understand what the barriers really are. Because what I'm not hearing, and tell me if I'm wrong, what I'm not hearing and what I'm not reading is America saying, no, we hate diplomacy. Diplomacy is gross, yuck. You know, the attack is not on diplomacy. The attack is on the idea that there should be concessions made by Ukraine in the least. Because the West posture is that this is an illegal war. And I'm not questioning that in the least, but that because this is an illegal war, because this is a territory invasion by Russia, that Russia, to concede anything, to allow Russia to gain even 1 inch, is to validate that initial bad act, that initial sin that has polluted this entire thing, which obviously puts any negotiations in a very difficult spot. Especially when you have some people saying that not only do we have to go back to the world that existed in January of 2022, but the world that existed back prior to the annexation of Crimea. And am I wrong to have intuited that that is a place that some people in the media sphere and in the political sphere are staking out as a foundational commitment of the West and of Ukraine? And if that's the case, what do you do with that? Where do you go from there? And is it possible? Are people right in some way to say that there's kind of no ethical way out of this if you allow Russia to have won anything from such a kind of flagrantly illegal action? How would you moot that?
Well, on that last one, let me just say, I don't foresee the West lifting sanctions on Russia if Russia is keeping a lot of Ukrainian territory, at least post February 2022. So the idea that Russia is gaining anything, I think Russia has lost big in this war already. The idea that Russia is a major military power outside of its nukes has been defeated by the Russians themselves in the way that they conducted this war. But as to the very core of your question, I think there's many, many different elements with different motivations. I think there's some who may be staking this position as part of a negotiation to start off the negotiations from the most maximalist position to have the most possible maneuverability to to utilize in such a negotiation. Others may be putting it forward in order to prevent negotiations, because when the two sides are taking such maximalist positions, and the Russians are taking completely maximalist positions as well.
What kind of positions are the Russians?
The Russians are saying that any territory that they have now annexed, and they say there's been elections there that decided to join Russia, that is now Russian territory, and those need to be regained by Russia. So this is completely off the table, not negotiable. That is a completely maximalist and unrealistic position that the Russians are taking. So we're in that phase right now in which both sides, one interpretation is, are just staking out very maximalist position as part of the conflict. Does not necessarily mean that once both sides become more serious, that those are the positions that they expect are going to survive the negotiation process. Others may be putting forward these things precisely to make it as difficult as possible to start negotiations. One of the things I think one has to recognize with negotiations of this kind, particularly when it comes to territory, is that if there is no flexibility on both sides, then there is an even greater risk that this will become one of these protracted conflicts in which there will never be a peace. There may be long, slow periods in which there's not a lot of fighting, but there will never be a state of peace, which then will really be to the detriment of Ukraine. Because unless there is some form of a peace, you're not going to see investments go back into Ukraine. You're not going to see any serious effort to rebuild that country. And that is a likely outcome if this war becomes protracted, which I think should give us more urgency to, at a minimum, do everything we can to explore ways out of this conflict rather than to take this allergic position that we have taken.
Do you think that the Biden administration is prioritizing the rebuilding of Ukraine and the interests of the Ukrainian people? I mean, like, I hear what you're saying, Dr. Parsi, but that kind of presumes that that's what's in the interest of the major actors here, that peace, that the end to fighting, that rebuilding Ukraine is the priority, as opposed to what these stated priorities have been, which is weakening Russia. And that is exactly why I think there is the skepticism about the U.S.'s willingness to engage in diplomacy. It's because all of the things that they've signaled so far that are their priorities and why we're even engaged in this conflict to begin with have nothing to do with the interests of the average Ukrainian living in Ukraine. Is that too cynical a take?
So, I mean, you may be quite right in that this may not be the number one priority right now. I think you could be quite right about that. But I do think, however, that as part of the broader debate, there needs to be an understanding that if we pursue the current path while pretending that this is, the best for the Ukrainians, and anyone who questions that is anti-Ukrainian, that there are significant flaws with that reasoning, because a protracted conflict will really come to the detriment of Ukraine and its ability to rebuild itself. So, for me to put that forward is not to accept the premise that that is the number one priority of the West, the Europeans, or the US right now. But it is an important point, I think, in being able to at least show that the reasoning that is put forward in order to continue the fighting, if it is for the sake of the Ukrainians, and that's a question mark, but if it is for the sake of the Ukrainians, there's significant flaws in that logic.
I'm going to let you go. You've been so generous with your time, and we're over an hour now. I did want to ask just one last quick question, because I asked this of Matt Duss. He came on shortly after the conflict emerged, Bernie's former policy advisor. At the time, I knew nothing about the conflict, nothing about really the history of the region. And I just had this one principle that I wanted him to weigh in on, which is how do you assess as a left-minded person, someone who does not want there to be a military solution to every problem? How do you assess when the United States should intervene militarily and give lethal aid to support a country like Ukraine that has been the victim of an illegal territorial dispute or any other kind of conflict that we've seen across the world? How do we know when the U.S. is getting involved because of a sincere humanitarian commitment or legal commitment versus when it is involved because it's advancing its own geopolitical interests, like weakening Russia? And how can you make the case for our involvement in Ukraine as opposed to other parts of the world where we could enumerate any number of humanitarian concerns and ways in which the American dollar could go toward alleviating those concerns? Do you have a sense of how to justify intervention? When do you think intervention is justifiable?
So one thing to clarify when restrainers are talking about military intervention is when the U.S. goes in itself militarily,
Sure.
which of course is a very different type of intervention. In a case here where you have another country being invaded, it is not against international law to provide lethal aid to a country that has been invaded. Where I think it gets to the core of your question, are we doing it to defend them? Are we doing it for other reasons? Are we trying to take other geopolitical gains from this? Well, one critical element is, what are we doing to bring the conflict to an end? What are we doing on the diplomatic front to really bring the conflict to an end so that the war actually ceases to exist? And that's where I think the question mark starts to come in. I don't think it is wrong to support the Ukrainians with weaponry since they have been invaded. The extent to which you do it, for the reasons, what kind of objectives you're putting forward, et cetera, that can all be discussed. But if we're doing it with so little effort at the same time to bring about a diplomatic solution to this, that's where I think the question mark starts to come in my mind as to why, okay, is this the right approach? Is it the right combination of measures? Because what we have seen in a lot of wars, particularly in civil wars, is that when outside powers provide weaponry, it tends to make sure that wars just keep on going and don't come to an end. In civil wars, for instance, the literature shows that most civil wars cannot last for more than a year unless there's foreign intervention coming in with weaponry, et cetera. Then they can go on for a very, very long time. What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to make sure that we have stability and that we reach some form of a peace, or are we trying to keep the war going? I'm not making an accusation. I'm just saying the combination of what we're doing, the way it is weighted right now, is not the right type of a proportion that I would like to see.
Well, look, I really appreciate you spending so much time with us here today, Dr. Parsi. Can you let our listeners know where to find more of you and your work on the internet?
They should go to the Quincy Institute's website, which is quincyinst.org.
Wonderful. And where can people find you on Twitter?
T Parsi.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
It's really my pleasure. And to the Bad Faith listeners, thanks for listening. You can catch an additional episode of Bad Faith every Monday at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. And I'll see you later tonight on Call In to discuss. Keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.